Okay, in today's video, I wanted to talk to you again about the difference between a basic will structure and trust planning structure, and the reasons as to why you would always go really for a trust planning structure over and above a basic simple will. But first of all, it's really important to understand 70% of the UK population currently have no planning whatsoever. No wills, no nothing, no planning, which means that 30% actually do have some kind of a plan in place. And most of you within that 30% will have a basic will structure. So what is a basic will structure? Well, if we take this estate, for instance, say for instance, this is me. I've got my estate, I've got a house, cash, some cars, bits and pieces, which makes up my estate. Bear in mind, it's taken me my entire life to create this estate. Yeah, that's important to understand. It's taken me my entire life to create this. Now, I've also set up a simple will that ultimately leaves all of my estate that I've created to my two children, 50-50. So let's say the estate is worth £1 million. Let's say I've paid all the inheritance tax on it. We've got a clear £1 million here now that's going to be distributed via my will directly into the estates of my beneficiaries. So £500,000 a piece. Now, what I've actually done at this point is I've actually transferred that 500,000 into my children's estates, which means I've increased the size of their estate for their own inheritance tax liability potentially. So what that also means is if I've already paid inheritance tax here when I passed away, because I ultimately just gave those assets to my children, chances are when they then pass away, we're going to pay inheritance tax for a second time on the assets that I actually created. That's what we call generational inheritance tax. That's the tax they don't tell you about, generational inheritance tax. More importantly than that, remember, it's taken me my whole life to create this. So again, if I've just given these assets to my son and my daughter, if my son now goes and gets married and then subsequently gets divorced, the divorced person, she's entitled now to potentially 250,000 quid of the estate that I created, not my son, that I created. So now I'm feathering a nest of people that I've probably never ever met. And that's not what I'm working my socks off for here to create this wealth here. I want my family and only my family to benefit from my estate. The problem I've got though is I'm just giving those assets directly to my children. The assets that I'm giving them are fully attackable within my children's lifetime, whether that be through a divorce, creditor claims, care fees, bankruptcy, whatever it may well be, because I've ultimately given them those assets. And that is always the problem we have with simple basic wills. Because again, like I say, I'm looking to try and protect what I've created for the benefit of my children and then future generations. And the only way I can do that is with a trust planning structure. So a trust planning structure is exactly the same. This is me again, got my £1 million estate once again, set up a will, but this time within the will, I've set up a trust. So what happens this time is, again, all the inheritance tax is paid. Now the assets, when I pass via my will, will be distributed not directly into the estates of my beneficiaries, but will be distributed into my trust. So my assets now belong to my trusts. Now this is where it's different. Now, when my children, well, first of all, my children have been named as beneficiaries and also trustees, so they can manage the assets within the trust and they can also benefit from the assets within the trust. That's really, really quite important. So, but the difference is that when my children come to the trust to take their inheritance, in the normal way, off they go and do whatever they want to do. I don't care what they do with the assets. The difference is that any assets they take from the trust will be loaned to them. So if it's loaned to them, it doesn't belong to them. The asset still belongs to the trust. That's really, really important. That's the bit that ultimately gives it the protection. So now, same scenario. If I've paid inheritance tax up here on my estate, now it's gone into the trust and these assets have now been loaned to my children. I'm not increasing the size of my children's estate by the inheritance that I've given them, because any assets were ultimately only ever loaned to them. Also, if my son in the same scenario gets married and gets divorced again, well, she's not entitled to any of the assets that I ultimately left my son, because I left those assets to trust, and those assets were only ever loaned to my son. You can only attack assets that actually belong to you. Loaned assets don't form part of my son's estate at this point, so she's not entitled to attack any of that because those assets still belong to the trust. Now, because this was loaned to my son, If he was to go to the casino, for argument's sake, and he put it on black and it came up red, well, then he's lost the lot. It's all gone. And if he hasn't got that £500,000 in his estate at the point that he passes away, well, in that point, there's nothing to come back to the trust. And all he's done at that point is disinherit the next line of beneficiary. That's it. But ideally, what we want to make sure happens is that the assets within the trust here are managed sufficiently to ensure that when my son passes away, that money comes back to my trust so that my then grandchildren can come forward, take the same money and the same assets and go and do the same thing over their lifetime, and so on and so on and so on. The other benefit to this is that because this was loaned to my son, if my son, when he passes away, has got a sizable estate himself, this loan is classed as a debt to his estate. So if he's got a debt to his estate for 500,000, I've reduced his inheritance tax liability by 500,000 because there's still a debt to his estate that needs to be paid back to the trust here so that the next line of beneficiaries can come forward. But the idea of all of this is making sure that what I'm working so hard to create up here is ultimately protected, fully protected for my children, first line beneficiaries, my grandchildren, their children, and so on and so on. So I can protect multiple lines of beneficiaries by adding simple trusts into my planning here, fully protecting those assets for my chosen beneficiaries. Hope you found that interesting. If you need anything from me, obviously, email me at the address above, and I look forward to speaking to you on the next one.